right. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Good. Welcome to our weekly Messy Conversation. I'm Anna Kwong, one of the organizer, and also I'm the chair of the undergrad programs in Santa Barbara. Today, our topic is anti-racist pedagogy. But before we start, here is a few announcements. Next week, we are going to have our book club. And you can see the chat, the selected chapters. And also we will provide discounts for that book. So inquire with us if you are interested in buying the book, okay? So those of you who are interested in joining us, please take note of that. For today, we ask that you mute for sound quality the first part of the Messy Conversation. We also are recording the session, so you all know that if you don't want to use our identity, or you may turn off your camera or change your name. At around 4:30, we will start inviting the floor audience to share your questions, comments, and concerns. You're welcome to leave your questions, your comments, or anything anytime now, okay? But for the time being, we would like to have our speakers or conversationalists, okay, start with their conversation, okay? So today we are very excited. We have two experts to share with us this topic. First is Dr. Robyn Jardine. Dr. Jardine is a social justice licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor, licensed professional counselor, and social justice activist. She owns and operates Life Solutions Counseling and Family Therapy in Dallas, Texas. She also served as the adjunct professor at California Lutheran University. Her scholarship and practice are grounded in dismantling systems of oppression, including systems of white supremacies. Dr. Jardine offers consulting services in anti-racist pedagogical practices, trainings, and curriculum review. Her goal is to transform culture into relational and inclusive learning environment. So welcome, Dr. Robyn Jardine. Our second speaker is Dr. Bethany Simmons. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor, licensed professional counselor, AAMFT approved supervisor, associate professor and director of MS Counseling Psychology for MFT program at Cal Lutheran University. Her current pedagogy research and publications apply systematic cybernetic theory to training and supervision, as well as broader social, political, cultural context to understand and address issues around social responsibility, power, privilege, cultural diversity, and mental health practices, particularly with oppressed, marginalized, and vulnerable population. Her own clinical work spans diverse settings, working with underserved and marginalized populations, including adults and juvenile inpatient, psychiatric hospitals, intensive outpatient programs, and private practice. So join me to welcome two experts, Dr. Simmons and Dr. Jardine. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you both here. Well, now you see, we all are very excited about this topic. Okay, the first thing that comes to our mind is that, can you share with us the historical, social, political context of racism in education, and how does this system impact relational dynamics today?
Well, thank you so much for allowing us to share some space with you all, and to really dive into this topic of anti-racism pedagogy. This obviously, for seasoned participants, know that this could be an entire 2-week course. So we're going to be very intentional and precise with some of our answers, but we know that this is only, skimming the surface. So the thing that I would really love for us all to sort of envision is think about the place where you grew up and what is that space where you sat in community with others, whether your friends or your family, but people that you felt close to. You know, who was around you? For me, it was the kitchen table. For others, it might be outside in a field. It might be sitting on the floor in a dwelling. It might be working. It might be standing on, just down the street in the neighborhood. But wherever that space was for you, this is the kind of atmosphere and conversation we would like to exchange with you in terms of Dr. Simmons and I. So when we're thinking about our historical, political, social context, the very fact that you are in here is an act of counterculturalism. This is not, to be anti-racist is countercultural. And it's to remind us that not only is our history, but also our present is not only built on the foundations of the system of white supremacy, but it is also continually pumped and perpetuated through that very system. And so that's important in terms of us as we think about education, because as educators, a lot of us want to think of ourselves as we're liberators. We're a part of a system that teaches and educates and helps free us and challenge the system and change the status quo. Our roots are grounded in the system of white supremacy, which is a system that was built very much on elitism, right? And so part of what I just wanted to have us all remind ourselves is we are in a hierarchical structure that was really built for elitists, white men, and that this is part of where we find ourselves. And as we are trying to change culture, to be anti-racist means to change culture, or is to be counterculture. The other thing I wanted to sort of, I'm an old student services practitioner. So reminding ourselves that community college and the introduction of community college in the 60s was what made education accessible. In that area of making it accessible, again, that's also a very countercultural move. What we are finding is that we are expanding the experience of education. And what does that actually mean? The other layer I want to throw in here is the generational layer. We probably have people in here of all different ages and all different experiences and roles at the university, from students to faculty to staff, to guest speakers. And so every one of us is going to be coming from a different generation. So there's also this generational shift that we're experiencing as it relates to what is happening in and outside the classroom. I'm 42 years old, and I caught myself a month ago saying, like, well, when I was in school. And so part of what's happening on the larger system is being anti-racist is not only challenging our context, it's challenging our relational dynamics to change. When we take this on board, it changes everything. And so I just wanted us to be starting to kind of go into the topic, understanding that this is way bigger than any classroom. This is when we talk about being anti-racist, we're talking about a fundamental shift. Dr. Simmons, did you have some thoughts?
I think just to add on to what you're saying is that what we're talking about is embedded and steeped in 400 years of structural and systemic oppression that our institutions are based upon, embedded within, and still indoctrinated. We're indoctrinated into these systems as a part of being in them. And how do we participate in them? And how do we participate in transforming and dismantling these oppressive systems? And we're talking about fighting structures that are much larger than ourselves. We're talking about fighting institutional university structures. We're talking about fighting the structure of academia, of education in our country, how we think about education, how we think about academia. And as you indicated, there are multiple levels of intersectionality of oppression across systems, across structures that we're fighting. So I think in our work, in this anti-racist work, this is no small task. And we're talking about these larger systems and structures that have rules that are operating in those systems and structures that dictate how we can and cannot relate. But what we're talking about is changing the rules of the system and the structure. And that's a whole other story. So that's, I would just sort of say, we're in the middle of that. And when we're talking about change, there are forces at play that we as systems therapists and thinkers talk about as homeostatic mechanisms, which we're going to find in our efforts to fight the oppression. We're going to find pushback. We're going to find forces at play to keep the system the same and keep the rules the same. So a part of our work has to be thinking about these things at a larger level and thinking about how the systems are organized and the rules that are at play and the power structures and where that power lies when we're thinking about change and our part in our participation in them.
Absolutely. And just sort of, to add on to that too, the idea as well is that this also affects us on a personal level. So in the classroom, what is happening maybe at the larger level with policies and procedures also funnels down to middle management, which also funnels down to the relationship between the faculty member and the student when we're looking at, power struggles that you mentioned, Dr. Simmons, related to compliance, wanting somebody to comply with you, and enforcing rules in the nature of how we relate. And we'll get into that more as we continue on. But just this idea that there are multiple things happening at the same time when we're really talking about contextualizing an anti-racist approach and an anti-racist approach in the classroom.
Okay, wow. This is really, we're talking about something very deep and something very broad, right? And it has been going on for a long time. So what are some of the examples of the dynamics that exist in a racist classroom versus an anti-racist classroom and the administration?
So some of the things that you may have already seen in your own classrooms, or if your students you've experienced, is the experience of wanting to bring up the discussion of race and getting shut down. Being told there's a class for that. Being told that's not what we're here to talk about. That is an example of a racist classroom. When you are a person of color, there is no separation. Your life is not segmented in that way. One of the things that I always try and remember as a white passing person who grew up in white culture, I'm also Indigenous, is that when you are not passing, that is something that you contend with throughout your, I'm sorry, I'll have to fix this camera. This thing is giving me trouble. That is something that you experience. There is no sectioning it off. It's something that's a part of the totality of your experience. And with race being, it is the fundamental organizing principle in our society today. So, when we think about intersectionality and all the other pieces that come with intersectionality, the first place that we are organized is by race, right? And so when we're talking about the classroom, that is an example of how white culture has been taught that race is something that happens outside of them, that is a construct that affects somebody else, that we are non-racial beings. And so to bring it up, that's a way of not talking about the real subject of why we're here. And so when you take an anti-racist pedagogy, what you do is in every class that you teach, in every class, no matter the subject, we talk about the system of white supremacy and social location and intersectionality, because part of what anti-racist pedagogy requires is that you contextualize not only yourself, but the people that you are in relationship with, because that is how our bodies interact with when we are out in the world. And part of what an education should be affording people is a reflection of what is out there in the field versus a sanitized version that is built to make white culture comfortable. And the other thing I would point out is white culture has been taught to also not look at race and racism, not talk about those things. And I use this phrase of saying, if you don't name and talk about what something is, you'll call it something else. And Dr. Simmons and I were just talking in tandem the other day, and I'm like, yeah, like you'll call it Thanksgiving. And so it's this idea of this sort of disassociation of what everyone else is having to live in versus people who identify in terms of white culture, who are finding themselves in positions of authority, are experiencing this way of experiencing attention and shutting down the conversation. One of the things that Dr. Simmons and I are bringing to this conversation as well is we have been doing work over the years of talking with students about what it is like for them to experience racism in the classroom. And we have gathered some information that we wanted to share with you all, both from participants that are students of color, self-identified as students of color, and also students who self-identify as a part of white culture. And so some of the experiences in this example I wanted to offer is coming from those responses, which are things like a white student saying, I wanted to bring it up in class and I brought it up and I was silenced and nobody said anything. Everybody went quiet, and all of a sudden everyone's looking around and nobody's saying anything. Or instructors saying that they're going to provide materials and then they never get back to it. A racist classroom our examples of it is Eurocentric curriculum and material with no other options in terms of exploring other aspects of who else has had an approach to whatever the subject matter it is, right? And then also the classroom is a space that is ripe for things like microaggressions, micro insults, things like tokenism. Other examples could be expressions of ethnocentrality, things like the centrality of whiteness. So anytime you're speaking about culture and you're othering another culture, if you're calling another culture strange or saying that things are quite bizarre, those sorts of things are ways of othering other people in the room. Another example of racism in the classroom has to do with your textbooks. Do your textbooks offer, or any of your curriculum material, do they offer any other language besides English? Do you offer that for students who are multilingual, whose language of origin is not grounded in English? Or is the materials that you are offering, if they are more dated, are they perpetuating Eurocentric stereotyping of not only whom the people that you are, maybe it's something about relationships, do they represent a diverse group, or is it still perpetuating the normalization of whiteness as the standard, right? Or are there other microaggressions that are in place of those materials? So those are some examples of what a racist classroom could look and sound like. The other side, I wanted to make sure, and I'm going to ask Dr. Simmons what her thoughts would be on, but also in terms of for faculty of color. So the experiences that they could have regarding students as well could be in terms of how they are characterized in terms of their approach as being aggressive, or people not liking their tone. So in both students' responses and faculty, tone policing is a big deal. Or even people being more challenging of instructors of color. Dr. Simmons, did you have some ideas about what a racist classroom could sound like and look like?
Yeah, I think you've said a lot of great things. I think just to add to that, just highlighting what is this space and who is it for, and who is determining the voices that are being shared, the perspectives that are being shared, the space for all perspectives, and also the space for, I think, acknowledging and directly addressing when racist things happen, addressing that directly, but also being able to have direct conversations about systemic racism. And is this a space where that can happen? And students can have those conversations, faculty can have those conversations. And in my role as a program director, I'm often also working with faculty of color who experience, just to expand on that piece as well, who experience discrimination in the classroom with students. And what are institutions doing so that the classrooms can be a space where we can talk about the nature of systemic racism and how that plays out in the classroom? How does that play out in the interactions that are occurring? And how can we create those spaces where this is being addressed and it's also not acceptable to have discrimination of any kind, microaggressions or not, in that space? And as we have already indicated, this is going to be sort of embedded at every level. So how institutions do this is vital for us to create learning spaces where people are able to show up to learn rather than be under attack or have to be protecting themselves in some way, or not being able to contribute in the learning environment because it's unsafe to do so in some way. And maybe this gets into our next prompt, I'm not sure, but I think that Dr. Jardine, you had some experiences that you wanted to share from students that they physically were in dangerous sort of situations in harm's way in the classroom.
Correct. So some of the reports of the students, we were just saying about how it felt to them in terms of their bodies. And so the students reported everything from either during times of being shut down or dismissed or being labeled as a problem. Everything from nausea to stomach issues to feeling embarrassed to shrinking to feelings of feeling like they took up too much space in the room, or feeling, then some of the feelings went internal, like what's wrong with me? Am I the only one having this? The feeling of being isolated and alone because nobody else says anything. So the impact of silence in the room. And then also this sort of duality of people going behind like, hey, I was right there with you. And it was like, really, where the hell were you? When it was really going down, right? And so it becomes very physiological, and many students reported wanting to leave, wanting to run, wanting to get out of there, feeling trapped, right? And feeling the pressure to conform, because at the end of the day, their education is on the line here, and you don't want to be seen as a problem, but you also understand that at the end of the day, you're already invested, right? And so with an anti-racist pedagogy, what this would look like would be a lot different. So number one, as part of the standard conversation is being self-reflective, where you're at in your own social location, what are your implicit biases? That's in every class conversation. Understanding yourself in relationship to the context, in relationship to history and how these things are being played out. When things are happening in the world, not just having classroom as usual. There was a mass murder. That should have been something that should have been brought to a classroom, even if you're teaching math, right? Because those things are happening in people's bodies, and that's all part of building a space for learning. If those things are playing out in people's bodies, they're not going to be fully present with you. And when spaces are in such a way to where people can have important differences, not just differences that don't make a difference, but they can show up in a way of saying, this is impacting me, then that's when the real exchange and dialogue happens. Right. And then that's when people really get exposed to other ways of thinking that hopefully will inspire them to continue to grow. Likewise, instructors will be able to have the necessary training and support to be able to know how to have these conversations, number one, but also help support in doing their own work of shifting out of the power domination dynamic, right? So it no longer becomes being seen as the expert, as having the only voice in the room that matters, right? Hierarchically, I'm the one that knows and you're the one that's supposed to know, or you're the one that's supposed to learn from me. It removes them out of the space of having to have all the answers and to control the conversation. It allows the professor to be able to be with them, but still responsible for holding a standard as it relates to things like skills that they're having to assess. But it also allows the professor to be human and not have to hide behind their power as knowing everything, so they can be more vulnerable with their students and saying, you know what, you bring up a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, right? The other part of it is that when there is a gap that is identified in your curriculum that is voiced by a student, that there is a thoughtfulness about ensuring that you don't create extra labor for that student. Sometimes and I say we, me included, I may say, well, hey, is that something that we can utilize as a topic in some of the work that you're going to be doing? That is only helpful if that is where the student was going before the need arose. If they were already planning to have that as a particular project and they're like, hey, and by the way, I'm not seeing this in your curriculum, that's one thing. But if they're coming up to you saying there is a gap in the curriculum that I don't feel visible and seen, can we have a conversation? That's something that I would want and hope that you would want to in the curriculum. It is incumbent on that particular faculty member to go back to their department head or their dean and doing curriculum evaluation and making some changes in the classroom as soon as the next class period, if that is something that you agree with, that there's a gap, versus trying to put it back on the student to fill in the gap, the content in the classroom. And so when we are able to sort of have these sharing of spaces, to me, that is when there is power in the classroom, because we are all doing the work. In an anti-racist pedagogical classroom, there's also space for repair. When there is a microaggression, and this is probably one of the most vulnerable I've ever personally felt, I had made, I would say it was probably more of a micro insult, but it popped out. Social conditioning will pop out when you least expect it. And the moment it came out, I wanted to take a vacuum and suck the words right back out of my mouth. And I had to, in real time, say, wait a minute, we need to stop class for just a second. And not only did I apologize to the person and to the group that they already self-identified with, I also apologized to the other groups that were present, because it affects the learning atmosphere. And then I went through a repair cycle with the students and used that as an example of how they're going to need to make repair cycles when they go out there in the world. So taking an anti-racist pedagogy approach will also teach the students and the faculty members of how to make repairs in the classroom, which only increase trust. Dr. Simmons, any thoughts about a anti-racist classroom?
I'm thinking we could talk about this for a really long time, but I know I'm looking at our time, and I'm thinking about we're only on question 2, and I'm wondering if we should keep moving.
Or Anna, do you want us to stop?
No. I have not seen the question yet. Eventually we will. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I can see Sarah Bev saying that please talk more about the repair cycle.
Okay. A repair cycle is where 2 or more people are in the space together, and it can go a couple of ways. One way is, can I please resend the message? That's one way. Another way is, which people can say no, and being vulnerable as a professor to hear a no, right? Or it could be, would you be willing to share with me how it landed for you, and then validating that. And it starts off like something like this. Let me see if I got that. the message that I sent to you, it landed on your body like this. Did I get that? Is there more about that? And you do it until there is no more. You're mirroring them. Once there is no more, then you make the apology. And the apology is, I hurt you. And I am deeply sorry for hurting you. And I can see that this is something that affected you. And what I would like to do is, if you're available, and it's okay if you're not, but what I would like to do is really extend my sincerest apologies and know that this will not happen again, because I regret saying that. You're not asking for forgiveness. You're not asking for another chance. You're honoring and validating that you see the hurt that you caused. And you are letting them know that you are making efforts to correct that. And so one of the examples that I would give to that is, there was a classroom one time that I had that was so saturated with white fragility, the students were. And I had one student of color, and it was tough. It was a really tough atmosphere because we were dealing with it every single class period. When are we going to get to talking about X, Y, and Z? And we were talking about X, Y, and Z. And the decontextualization of race, particularly in the work that I do as a marriage and family therapist, was deeply concerning. And the anxiety that it created for my student who was a student of color was something that it increased what I needed in terms of my support for them. But also I needed support that I didn't feel confident that I had, which can also be very isolating for instructors, right? And faculty members. So a repair cycle is important because what it does is it allows students and faculty, whether it be student to student, faculty to student, it allows for an experience of people to not only share their experiences with each other, but it allows you to make true amends. Because you do not offer a repair unless you're sincere. Unless you want to know how you impacted somebody else, right? Regardless of your intention, regardless of what you thought. But if you're open to doing that, then that vulnerability then says, guess what? We can fight the system of white supremacy by fighting perfectionism. There is a link I'd be happy to give out at the end of session. There's a workbook called Dismantling Racism, and it goes into the characteristics of a white supremacist society. And one of the first things that it talks about is, in white supremacist society, a characteristic that shows up in relationships is perfectionism. I bet if we all got in a room, I said, how many of you have ever dealt with perfectionism? Raise your hand. Normally it's 99%, at least 99%. So it starts to help us remove the barriers that are created that prevent us from fully connecting with each other and connecting in a meaningful way. When that happens, your classroom, all your discussions become more meaningful. And then we remove the white supremacist idea that the professional and the personal are separate, because they're not. They're extensions of one another, right? There is no separating that out. Sarah, I hope that you answered that. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think to add to that, this idea that we're taking personal accountability for wherever we're at and whatever we're doing, our actions. And I think that's an important piece in the repair, is that you're taking accountability for your actions and you're committing to changing, that you're willing to do the work to change and to learn and grow, and that you're not putting that, you're not dismissing it, you're not minimizing it, you're not putting it off onto somebody else. It's your responsibility. And I think particularly for white faculty, it's our responsibility to educate ourselves on anti-racist work, on the system of racism, the components of structural racism, and to really understand how these things operate. It is not people of color's responsibility to teach us about that. And so we have to do the work. And I think, I think that's really important. This is going to be, if you are a white identifying or presenting person, this is a lifelong process of learning.
Right.
And improving and doing better. We, again, to that point of perfectionism versus self-growth, if we can get out of that perfectionism mindset and understand that we have a lot to learn and grow and do better, even the efforts that we're making are not enough. And so I think taking that personal accountability to do what we can to make change, but to educate ourselves is really necessary.
Yeah. And I would even, Dr. Simmons, you inspired me in this moment. I would even say, do what you can't do, because what we can do isn't even enough. And I think, to your point about, what was it you just said? You said something. What was the last thing you said, Dr. Simmons? This happens, y'all, for me. What was the last thing you just said?
I don't know. I think I just said, it's a lifelong process of taking accountability and being responsible. You got it. Okay.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So the other thing was too, like when you're in a position of power and authority, being careful about how, because this is all part of the repair process, right? Being careful to not be the defining narrative of what is happening in that relationship. Phrases like, you misunderstood, you are this, those are all blaming statements and taking positions of power and authority. And where it shuts down the other person, because the only thing that's protecting you is your power. If you didn't have that role and responsibility, that may be a totally different conversation, right? So there's a phrase, and this, again, this is all linked to a repair, but in the sense of what not to do. But if you lead with your comfort, you will shut down in your discomfort. If you lead in your comfort, you will shut down and disconnect in your discomfort. And so that's important too, whether there is a hierarchical difference or even parallel when we're having these sorts of conversations. I appreciate you bringing that up, Dr. Simmons. That was fabulous.
And I'm going to jump in and orient us to the next question. I think, thank you so much for addressing that. And I was trained as a psychologist, and I never heard anybody articulate repair so clearly. And I think that is just such a useful set of strategies that you shared. And also, I know that everybody's idea of repair is very different. And some people have never even heard of that idea used that way. And I think that speaks to relationship that are so important to build. And that's here what Jacqueline has brought into the chat for us. So Jacqueline, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, it wasn't, I'm on the spot. I'm sorry, I was taking notes. It wasn't necessarily a question as an observation of what you were both expressing for the instructor or the person in power, shall we say, and the student to continue that dialogue. What I find most of the time is if you're going to take the time to have that conversation immediately when it takes place in the classroom, there's also this opportunity, and I feel as an instructor, a responsibility of mentoring, and that mentoring is supposed to be reciprocal in this situation, in this educational setting. Yeah. It's supposed to be reciprocal for the professor as well as for the student. And I think that it's always an opportunity for someone or for a professor or for someone to say, look, I'm sorry that this situation happened. We have this conversation that has begun the repair. But knowingly, those two people, regardless of everybody in the classroom, are going to walk away and still have thoughts about what happened. And there has to be a follow-up that is one-on-one. And I can't say it enough with the mentors that I've had at Antioch. and the mentors that I've had in other students, that conversation, it needs to be an offering, and it's a peace offering that's one-on-one, that strips away the pressure and allows for a safe space to take place without judgment, for understanding, and not necessarily in the classroom space. And those two things together is what makes our campus unique. It makes the ability for us to create these new dynamics and that change to be effective, and for us to have confidence in our campus and our students and the education that we're going to receive here. So I think that's a part that really needs to be stressed. If a professor is stumbling or feels uncomfortable, or even with all the, okay, I got to figure out how to have this conversation in an open-minded fashion, follow-up is key. It is important. And for the student, usually if the follow-up doesn't go wrong, it's greatly appreciated. So I love what you said. I think it's a great start, but I think there's that extra step that also needs to be a part of it.
I think that's such a great point. Thank you so much for sharing that in this space, because we're talking about relationship, but also this idea of real repair is not performative. And that's what I was thinking when you were talking, Jacqueline, is to be able to reach out to that student and say, can we keep talking about this, or can we meet to talk a little bit more, really shows the relational care and concern that this isn't just me demonstrating this in front of an audience. I really care about you and I want you to be okay. And I want to make sure I understand so that I don't misstep again, or I'm not hurtful and harmful. And so I think that's such a great point to bring up in this space.
I would like to add, Miss Jacqueline, and that is one, that be done with consent, because some woundings are deep enough to where they may not want to meet with us. I mean, I don't know how, because you're so fabulous, obviously. I can tell that this is like your wheelhouse, mentorship, right? You have a spirit that exudes it. But sometimes one is making sure that it's consensual, that the student is not feeling pressure to show up. And then number two, that when you're in that offering, the repair is a repair when the receiver says it's a repair, not when the sender offers the act. And I think that's important so that students don't feel like they have to conform to making their instructors feel better about a misstep, you know?
That's correct. At the same time, you know, as they say, an olive branch is an olive branch. There's not, if a person decides that is something that they want to carry with them, it is a conscious decision.
That's right.
Making, but you have to allow that person that opportunity, because I have been in this situation, and unbelievably enough, at Antioch. And let me tell you, it is not the easiest thing to do.
It is not easy.
But it is necessary to our engagement, and it is absolutely necessary for a person to have a choice of yes or no.
That's exactly right.
So I hope that's a consideration.
Thank you for being brave. Yeah, but thank you for being brave to do that, because as a faculty member, that takes courage. So that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Jen, who had to leave us, left a note and said, so grateful for the space. As a former elementary school teacher, I observed othering in classrooms far too often. And in hindsight, even in my own, repairs are huge. So I, and a thank you there. And so I think of what Jacqueline just mentioned as really so key, is that there's just complexity in these dynamics, and then we don't often know each other very well. and we're trying to navigate the little that we do connect on in class. There's no other questions posted here in the chat. Does anybody else have any comments or questions they want to add? All right, well, just maybe you can continue your conversation.
Okay. Well, our next question has to do with, what are some of the recommendations that we would have in terms of shifting the culture in whatever culture that we're in. So we're talking about Antioch, and some of the things that that I think are helpful and from my own lens is accountability. I remind myself that these hierarchical systems are producing the fruit that they're built to produce. Hierarchy is inequity, and an inequitous hierarchical system is not going to produce equity. And so it's the irony is that the system that produces inequity, now we have some systems saying that no, we are for justice, we are for equity, we are for collaboration, which is anti-theoretical to its mere existence, right? And so one of the things that I think something that I think is important is for us to really put pressure on administration. Whoever is the person who makes the decisions, not the process of how you get there, but putting pressure on the decision makers. One of the first places that I go is money. Okay, so you've said you want to take on this position and to market yourself in such a way. That's wonderful. Show me the money. Show me where you are providing support for your faculty. Show me where you're providing support for your students. That can be both in line items regarding time away from like course releases. Show me the resources that you are allocating their way in terms of trainings. Show me the mentorship and the additional faculty this could require, the additional support staff that this would require in making a cultural shift. So we're moving away from this idea that this is just a line item that we're putting in our syllabi. And this is just a line item that we're putting in our rubric so that we can make sure through accreditation that we line up. This is saying, where as a campus are you fundamentally fiscally supporting this cultural change that you say that we are committed to? This is an issue that campuses all over the world are having, right? In terms of reconciling those two areas. Number two, for me, is mandated training. Mandated, not optional, and that it's ongoing, and that it's quarterly. You are deconditioning and decolonializing your relationship with yourself, with the people in your family, with the people at work, with the students, people with positions of power. Decolonialization and deconditioning does not happen with one training a year. And it does not happen if it's just with the administration or if it's just with the faculty. It has to be on every level because racism occurs systemically at every single level. So my encouragement is to look at ways, a lot of times people will say, well, bloom where you're planted, do the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit will be confined to the system's rules. So even if you are making changes at that level, you're not making fundamental changes that change the rules of the game. You're changing with the existing parameters. So my encouragement is to organize, collaborate, be collective about the voices, to put pressure on the powers that be, on people like the chancellor, on people that are, on the academic affairs side, on the fiscal budgeting committee, like putting pressure on them to say, we want a line item. We want a line item that supports culturally shifting this work, because it's not fair to put all of the burden on faculty. And it's not fair to put the burden on on middle management that is simply carrying out what upper management allows them to do. So it really is saying we are moving from a performative space where we're checking the boxes to a space where you can feel it, you can see it. Those are a couple of recommendations. Dr. Simmons?
I see Anna has her hand raised. I want to check.
Oh, sorry, good point.
No, why don't you go ahead, Dr. Simmons, you make your response, and then I have a couple of questions to ask.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just to further that, I think that, again, people can only do what the system allows and the limits within the system. So if the institution is, putting into place, let's say, a mission, values, they're putting out statements about what the institution's support is for anti-racism work on campus or DEIJ efforts, there has to be resources to embody that work. And so, I think fellow faculty, you're overburdened and overworked and underpaid, I would imagine. And if not, I might see if you're hiring. I'm in a department that has 3 core faculty that are trying to manage a very large program of training clinicians across 3 locations. And we're lucky that we're even functioning. So, I think it's just the idea that if we're going to say we're going to do something, there have to be the actual resources and structures in place in order for that to happen. And oftentimes faculty, we have a voice and we have to use it, and whatever power and action we have to promote that change. But as Dr. Jardine indicated, I think a lot of times where the power of those decisions lie is not in the faculty's hands. So where do we have that ability to shift things? Structurally is where we have to focus our efforts as a group, because there are power in numbers. And I think when the faculty come together to support a voice together in these efforts, there's more opportunity for that. But I think that, what we're seeing a lot is this commitment without any ability to fulfill the commitment. And that puts strain and stress on every level. And then you have students who are paying money saying, I'm coming here for this education that's supposed to be anti-racist, that's supposed to be inclusive, that's supposed to be, meeting all these initiatives that you put out there. And I'm not experiencing any of it. In fact, I'm experiencing the opposite. And so when we're talking about this, we're talking about resources to retain students, resources to retain faculty. We're talking about creating an environment, a system that has the support in place to actually embody what the institution is proclaiming. So anyway, I'll get on my soapbox about that. So, Anna.
Dr. Simmons, as if you read my mind, actually, this is a question from the floor. You've answered part of that question already, okay? You have a crystal ball or something like that, okay? How can administration be sure to provide an inclusive and supportive environment for students of color and for students in particular cultural programs such as a Latinx mental health concentration?
Well, so I think resources support being able to hire faculty of color, being able to retain faculty of color, creating spaces where students and faculty of color want to be and want to stay. But also, I think it's creating intentional spaces within the institution of support. So meeting, creating those spaces with the intention of this is an ongoing place that we are going to support our faculty and students of color on a regular ongoing basis. And this is how we're going to do it. So I think it takes a specific intention to create and sustain those spaces, but also having spaces for white students and white faculty and staff to have further training and support where they're needing to have it as well, around white fragility, around the aspects of white supremacy that get manifested in those spaces and relations, and not to and have those separate spaces. Cal Lutheran has gone through quite a few things in the past. Let's see, I've been there since 2014. So since 2014, since I've been there, where they've made intentional efforts to put hiring practices in place, where we have equity advocates. We've had consultants come from USC about how to recruit and retain faculty of color. And in the past couple of years, we've still had a mass exodus of faculty of color and staff. And it's been disheartening to see people who are supposedly committed to social justice, to DEIJ efforts, watching my colleagues of color be mistreated and discriminated against in a way where their voices, and people who supported the voices to have those resources and places of support, leave the institution because embodied was not what was happening. It was not embodied action. And to see that, I think is, it just says how much more needs to be done. And I think that even when you put these structures in place, you're going to have, if you remember, I said homeostasis at the beginning of this talk, you're going to have those forces at play that try to keep things the same. And sometimes that means it escalates as you're making change happen. You get a stronger response to try to keep things the same. And so I think that it's, how can we build those in? I think that's creating the spaces. And I think it's being realistic about the burdens that employees already experience in the system. You can't add on changing an entire institutional structure on top of your regular duties of a job, even though it should be built into your duties. But that would be a change in the rules of the system, right?
Thank you. Thank you. Very well said. And actually, you do actually have a crystal ball. That's the second question, is talk about how to actually recruit and maintain the instructor of color. And you answered that already. Thank you. Back to you, Sarah Beth.
Thanks, Anna. I just put the link to the messy conversation for today, where this video will be uploaded. And so I invite you to take this and share it with your classroom, including your faculty, including your colleagues, administrators, and also to take this question of how does repair work for people in this classroom or discussion. And we have Brittany here waiting to add her comment or question. Go ahead, Brittany. And also we have to let folks go right before you get started with that. So thanks for and we'll continue this conversation for a little bit for those who want to speak.
Sarah, I just want to make one announcement so those who may need to leave can. This has to do for students. There is a group that has formed that is not connected with the university, but they are full of Antioch students. It is called the Council for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It is a group that is dedicated to anti-racist activism on campus. If you are interested in joining a community like that, please feel free. Thank you, Fox. Fox put the email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out to them. They would love to connect with you. For any faculty that would like to be not allies, but advocates. Allies are people that will buy your donuts when you're trying to fundraise. Advocates will march with you in the streets. So anyone who might be interested in being advocates with this group, feel free to reach out and let them know of your interest. So thank you very much for letting me make that announcement. Brittany, I'm so sorry to cut you off. Are you available?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm fumbling around with the phone.
Okay.
No, I'm really glad that you did, because my input, I don't think will add anything other than just being an active voice as opposed to a passive one, which is what I'm hearing a lot, I've been in a lot of these conversations, and that's as far as it goes. The implementation and the evaluation seems to be the point where we all drop the ball. And I say all because I am including myself, as in not knowing what that next step is. So with what you just said, I know where my next step is, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for today. I won't keep anybody. I just want to say thank you.
Brittany, there is a training that I do. This is not a shameless plug. I want to make sure you know where some of the resources are coming from. So I'm what they call a master safe conversations trainer. Some of this repair process is coming from Safe Conversations. So if you go to safeconversations.org, or if you just contact me by email, I'd be happy to share with you and maybe connect you with some resources.
Outstanding. Is your information already in the chat and I just need to scroll up?
Miss Anna, is that, I can put it in there.
Yes. go
Okay,
ahead.
beautiful.
Yeah, go ahead. We are quite an informal platform. And I think, Sarah Beth, we did announce that the formal part of the messy conversation is now completed. So if you need to leave, please feel free. But those of you who like to hang around to stay a little bit more of an, even more, a more private space, I mean, you are welcome to stay.
Thank you, Anna. Dr. Datar has a question. Dr. Datar, did you want to ask your question?
I was just wondering if there are any particular institutions that they would point to as a model for the work that they're talking about.
So our institution hired consultants from USC. There is a center there. Let me pull up my note here. The Center for Urban Education at USC Rossier School of Education would be a great place to turn to. They have a lot of resources. They also have a lot of research that you can use. And then of course they can do consulting around how to change these structures and institutions to be more equitable, just. And then they were the center that we hired in our faculty search hiring processes to completely overhaul the way that we structure that process, how we recruit faculty of color. And then we're still working on the retaining faculty of color. And I really appreciated Bonnie's comment in the chat about we need to change the system and structure in order for people to be able to come to the institution and stay at the institution. So I think that that would be where I would recommend to start looking, and they also will have a lot of resources available there.
Bonnie, did you want to add anything else?
Sure. I mean, on a totally unrelated note, we've been talking or using the word pedagogy, and it just this last week, it came up that maybe when we're talking about pedagogy, since all of our students are considered adults and we are adult learners as well, we're really talking about andragogy, which is adult learning. And we often use the word pedagogy when we really mean andragogy. And that came up, and I just wanted to think about that because adult learning is very different than how children learn. So, and yes, systems, you know. And Jacqueline Rose also commented on my comment about we need to fix the institution and before we invite people, but it really is a both and. I just think we need to focus on making, maybe we, Antioch particularly, feels to me like we need to make a more welcoming environment before actively trying to, not before, but, or we have to be honest about it when we are recruiting people of color about where we're really at, because it doesn't do anyone any good.
Because the thing is, you know, I have such a strong affection for Bonnie anyways. She's one of my heroes. So, but to Bonnie's point, the thing is, the institution is drawing the very people who are pressuring the system into accountability. Like, you're drawing the very folks, you're going to be drawing activists, you're going to be drawing people that are committed to social justice. And so the beautiful thing is that you're going to get them. But when they show up, they're going to be expecting congruence, right? They're going to be expecting to experience a system change. And I think too, Bonnie, what was sparked on the inside of me when you shared that had to do with Robyn DiAngelo's statement about, when either presenting white or self-identifying white professionals speak to, quote unquote, the myth of the pipeline, like there's nobody in the pipeline or nobody wants to come here. She states in her book the idea that the data doesn't support that people of color in these positions. It's not that they're there, they are there. It has to do with, number one, don't promote colonialistic thinking with anti-racist rhetoric. And number two, the other thought was, what is your community like, in a sense of how you recruit, and then also how do the environments that you create where people of color or BIPOC community members will come and know that there is a place and a space for them. Because the thing of it is like, no matter where people of color go, there aren't spaces for them. That is not something that would shy many away. But if you go into a space being promised something, and then my grandma calls it, and you're given, the green weenie, that's what she calls it. You're bamboozled, you're tricked. It can create some feelings about what you were offered.
There's more here in the chat. We have some comments. Mark had to go, but he said his comment is power / hierarchy's role in maintaining the systems that need to shift. He was referring to the comment that was made earlier about, I think the comment that Bonnie made and that Jacqueline validated. Also,
Sarah Beth, I think Dr. Kenny has a question. Yes.
Sarah, did you want to keep going? I mean, I didn't mean to stop what you were doing.
Go ahead. I'll pull in a comment if I catch one when you're finished. Thanks, Sandra.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Jardine and Dr. Simon. Really appreciate the depth of the conversation. Wondering, in your experience, if you look, I mean, I'm always struck, not coming from this country, how we are always only talking about what's happening in the US, even in these conversations. So any research, outreach of what's happening in other countries that may be a little less polarized in the United States of America and don't have as strong of the history of racism. Any insight there in terms of what's happening elsewhere that might inform the way of doing things?
I mean, to the credit of white supremacy, it's a global phenomenon. I think about indigenous communities. I think Dr. Kenny, I think don't you have connections with Canada? Is that right? Yeah, I was thinking about, I've been reading a lot of indigenous communities and what they've been reporting in terms of what's happening with Canada. And, I think about different countries in terms of the impact of colonialization on the entire continent of Africa and Europe. And I mean, I'm naming, continents versus countries because this is a global issue. So I think it's a great question, because from what I've been gathering and reading in my own research is I don't know of a place that hasn't been touched by colonialism in some form or fashion, even if the histories, are not one for one, identical. For instance, like in Europe, slavery was out of the mainland. Slavery was in the islands and in the Pacific and things like that. And so it's still there, but it doesn't show up in the same way as in the States where people were here. and the generational transmission of that. Dr. Simmons, do you have any research or anything in terms of communities where this hasn't? Was it maybe a different story with it, maybe? Is that right, Dr. Kinney?
I'm more interested in academia. I mean, I know all of, but more in academia, when you have, more of a diverse community, then therefore you might see things plays out a little different in terms of relationship and what, or maybe not. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's just, I'm just curious of,
Good question. Dr. Simmons, do you have a thought?
I don't. And that's not been an area of my research, but I think it's a really great area to expand.
Definitely.
My focus has been on the context here in the US, but I think to look at what does this look like in other places, I think to the point of colonization has touched every area of the globe. And I think, looking at what other institutions are doing in other places is a great area of research.
We need to add to the list.
I just want to, if I can, add to what you were asking, because when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about racism in particular, and I think by concentrating on that word so succinctly, it doesn't allow for the breadth that Kinney is discussing, as far as examples, because a lot of the examples that are happening that are outside of the United States, it's not like a Black person shows up, because we're talking about racism, just use Black people because that's me. It's not like a Black person shows up and is still not discriminated against because they don't know in another country what Black person they're dealing with. So I think it's a very narrow idea, and the way the conversation is going, there are plenty of examples of how other campuses in Europe, in Asia, in Northeastern Europe, how they tackle these issues. And I think that people are taking it for granted that we saw that play out with the war with Ukraine and Russia, and how there were so many people that left Ukraine that were of African descent, part of the diaspora, but from all these different countries, and had such a difficulty finding a place that would take them in. So I think that's a bigger discussion, and it's a bigger discussion about what we mean as a campus when we say the word diversity, because I know that there are students that have had language delays that had difficulty expressing that with the professor. I know that there's people that have had all these different type of difficulties that don't have anything to do with the shade of their skin. And that's, without a high grade tanning lotion. I mean, so we're just gonna have to figure out, we're gonna have to define what we mean as an institution when we're speaking to people, and try to understand what they're looking for that's gonna make our campus attractive, and also ask them what they're going to be able to offer to us as a campus to make it more inclusive, because it's not just about the color of the skin. We have to get down and dirty and deep.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, because it is and it isn't. It's both, right? And I think about it's a great example of what happened in Ukraine. And if I remember it, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of students went to Ukraine because it was most affordable. Like, it was a great place to get a good education. And I was watching, you can ask Dr. Simmons, like, I was glued to the TV for 5 weeks straight, because it was horrific what was happening at the border, where people were being turned away for the color of their skin and where they were assumed to be from. So some were Ukrainian, but who were Black Ukrainians who were told, no, you over there, and named why they were over there. So I really appreciate what you're saying when you're saying diversity, and also build, what are they coming into? Should that be something, yeah, I thank you for bringing that up. That was very powerful.
Okay, so that is 5:16 now. Should we wrap this up and officially thank Dr. Robyn Jardine and Dr. Bethany Simmons. This is an amazing conversation. And of course, thank you for those who contribute from the audience, Jacqueline, Bonnie, and a few of you who actually asked questions. This have actually started a path for us to begin to learn and rebuild our foundation and rethink about how we approach our teaching. And also, how do we learn? How do we teach and how do we learn? Okay, so let's give a round of applause for both of them. Thank you so much. You both are my heroes and bringing out the topic and handling it so beautifully. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone else who joined us in Messy Conversation. Don't forget, next week we have the book club. So we look forward to seeing all of you again.
And you may get your book at Malik Bookstores, one of our partners, and it's a discount if you go to the link for Malik Bookstore.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.